All right, let's talk about something you hear in the news all the time: economic sanctions. They're presented as this massive hammer in foreign policy, right? A tool so powerful it can bring a country to its knees. But here's the thing: they almost never work the way we think they do. And that's the paradox we're digging into today.
So let's get right to the core puzzle. Sanctions are designed from the ground up to absolutely cripple a country's economy. That is their entire purpose. So, why doesn't that happen most of the time? There's this huge gap between the theory of sanctions and what actually plays out in the real world, and that's what we're going to explore. Okay, before we get into why they so often misfire, let's just make sure we're all on the same page. What are sanctions exactly? Well, think of them as a way to fight a war without firing a single shot. Instead of using armies and tanks, you're using finance and trade as your weapons. They are the go-to tool for putting serious pressure on another nation. And how do you do that? You go for the economic jugular. You target the absolute lifelines of a nation. We're talking about cutting off their banks from the global system, freezing their financial assets, blocking their ability to trade, and paralyzing their most important industries, like oil or technology. The goal is simple: squeeze them and create as much economic pain as possible.
Now, on paper, there's a very clear, very logical playbook for how all this economic pain is supposed to lead to political change. It's a whole theory based on escalating pressure.
And here is that playbook. It looks like a perfect cause and effect chain, almost like a line of dominoes. First, you cut off their banking access. That makes it harder to trade, which means their revenue plummets. Then, their currency gets weaker, and the people start to feel the pain. That public pressure is supposed to build and build until, in theory, the government has no choice but to give in. It seems like an unstoppable sequence.
But, and this is a huge but, this is exactly where that simple theory runs headfirst into a brick wall called reality. Because targeted economies don't just sit there and take the hit. No way. They react, they innovate, and they adapt in ways the playbook just doesn't account for.
So let's talk about the first big escape hatch: trade. When you slam the front door shut and block a country's main trade routes, they don't just give up. They immediately start looking for the back door, the side window, any way they can to keep goods and money moving. And this is how they do it. A blocked port doesn't mean trade is over. It just means it gets a whole lot more creative. They forge new alliances with countries that aren't part of the sanctions. They route their goods through neutral third-party nations that act as go-betweens. And pretty soon, entire gray market supply chains spring up just to fill the gaps.
And guess what? It is the exact same story when it comes to finance. When you cut a country off from the global financial system, which is overwhelmingly dominated by the US dollar, they don't just stop moving money. They start building their own parallel systems.
This is a real game changer because it builds incredible resilience. They develop their own payment networks specifically to bypass the old ones. They actively reduce their reliance on the dollar by trading in other currencies. They'll even turn to digital currencies or sophisticated modern-day barter systems. The money still flows, it just carves out a completely new riverbed.
And finally, there's what might be the most significant long-term effect of all. Sanctions force huge changes inside the country. You know the old saying, necessity is the mother of invention.
I mean, think about it. If you suddenly can't import something, you really only have two choices: go without it or figure out how to make it yourself. Sanctions often trigger this massive push for self-sufficiency, what economists call import substitution. Local industries get retooled to produce everything from essential goods to high-tech components. This fundamentally reshapes their entire economy from the inside out.
So when you add up all of these adaptations, the new trade routes, the new financial systems, the new domestic industries, you end up with an outcome that looks absolutely nothing like what the sanctions were supposed to achieve in the first place.
And this really captures the core paradox perfectly. The expectation is a straight line. You apply pressure, which leads to collapse. Simple. But the reality is a feedback loop. The pressure forces adaptation, and that adaptation actually creates a new system, one that's often more resilient and self-sufficient than the one it replaced.
So instead of the economy just falling off a cliff, the impact almost always follows this predictable pattern. First, there's the initial shock. Sure, the currency weakens, trade gets chaotic, but then comes the adjustment phase. That's when all those creative workarounds we just talked about get put into place. And finally, the economy stabilizes at a new normal. It doesn't collapse, it morphs.
And this is the most important takeaway. Sanctions don't actually stop countries. They force them to change how they operate. It's less like building a dam to stop a river and more like dropping a giant boulder in its path. The water doesn't stop flowing. It just carves a new channel around the obstacle. Sanctions don't destroy an economy. They force it to evolve.
This new reality brings us to a final, crucial reevaluation of the whole idea. If sanctions don't really work as a tool of economic collapse, then what on earth do they actually accomplish?
Because at the end of the day, the perception of sanctions as this definitive, knockout punch weapon just doesn't match the evidence. Yes, they create hardship. Yes, they cause massive disruption. But the idea that they can single-handedly force a major government to completely change its core policies, well, that turns out to be a myth more often than not.
And that leaves us with this final provocative question to think about. If sanctions don't lead to collapse, what is their true purpose? Are they just a powerful way to signal disapproval, a long-term tool meant to slowly degrade an adversary's capabilities over decades, or something else entirely? Understanding that they force adaptation, not collapse, changes how we have to think about one of the most widely used tools in modern geopolitics.